Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith. Hey everybody, this is Brian back with another episode of Grief to Growth, and today I've got with me my friend, Dr. Terri Daniel. Terri and I have known each other for, I guess, a couple of years now. Our paths keep crossing. We've taught several classes together, and Terry's a fascinating person. You're going to be really interested to hear her story, but I'm going to introduce her. Dr. Terri Daniel is a hospice and hospital-trained spiritual care provider and end-of-life educator. She conducts workshops throughout the U.S. and teaches spirituality and bereavement to chaplaincy students at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Terri is also the founder of the Afterlife Conference and the Ask Dr. Death podcast, and she's the author of 4 books on death, grief, and the afterlife. Terri had no idea what she'd be when she grew up until she was in her early 50s when her son Danny died at age 16 after a long struggle with a rare metabolic disorder. Danny began communicating with her after his death, and his guidance in this world and the next changed everything for Terri. She started out as a hospice volunteer. She went on to spend the next several years in academia, pursuing degrees in religious studies and pastoral counseling, and she also launched the Afterlife Conference, which is now in its 11th year. And over the years, Terri has helped hundreds of people learn to live, die, and grieve more consciously. Her work is acclaimed by hospice professionals, spiritual seekers, therapists, theologians, and academics worldwide. And you can find Terri at www.spiritualityandgrief.com and at www.afterlifeconference.com. So with that, I want to welcome Dr. Terri Daniel.
Hey, Brian. Thank you, my friend. Hello. Hi, everybody. Really nice to be here.
Yeah, Terri, it's good to see you again. I haven't talked to you in a while, so I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you. But so for our audience that doesn't know you as well as I do, tell me how your journey started.
Well, I started out as actually a very mystical and spiritual kid. I was always really in tune with my dreams. I was always getting messages and having feelings and all that. But I'm not a psychic or a medium. I preface my story to say that I was always kind of in tune with that stuff. I was always super fascinated by religion and spirituality. I was raised essentially with no religion. My parents were secularly and socially Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was about 16, I decided to read the Bible just because I was curious about what all the fuss was about. We didn't even have a Bible in my house. I had to go out and buy one. And I knew immediately on reading it that, oh yeah, you're not supposed to take this literally. You're supposed to read between the lines and interpret everything. Then when I was 19, I read the Tibetan Book of the Dead and books by some of the really popular mediums in those days. This was the 1960s, late 60s. And just kind of got on this spiritual path. In terms of what I do now, if you fast forward a whole lot of years to in my 40s, my 10-year-old son was diagnosed with a rare life-threatening illness and given 5 to 10 years to live. And he died at 16 and began communicating with me very clearly and in great detail 30 minutes after his death.
Mm-hmm.
So from that, I wrote my first book, A Swan in Heaven. And I felt like all my spiritual preparation that I had done all those years was really just leading me up to that, to, having to deal with the death of a child. Because I had so many sort of Buddhist leanings, I believed in reincarnation. I believed in soul contracts. And when he was diagnosed, and everybody around me was freaking out and falling apart, and I was too, of course, I still had this other feeling about it, which was, oh, what an interesting plan we apparently have together. He's going to die at 16, and I do all this spiritual stuff, and there must be some connection between those two things. And so along with the grief and the fear and all the sadness of losing him, I also had this other thing going on, which was curiosity about the spiritual and metaphysical meaning to all of it. And that really helped me not become devastated by grief, but to kind of become friends with grief and kind of walk hand in hand with it.
Yeah. So you had this spirituality before, and you had this studying of death and the afterlife and all that. But then when Danny died, transitioned, is that when you started the academic aspect of it? Because I know you kind of like went fast forward and everything.
I did. Well, so when Danny died, I mean, he had a long illness. He was disabled severely for the last half of his life. And so it was a long process of preparing for his death. And at his actual death, he's the first person that I ever saw die. And of course, I was at the bedside, not when he took his last breath. I was actually vacuuming the house when he took his last breath. It happens often that way. But the process of being with a person as they're dying, especially in the active dying phase when they're really not fully in their bodies, is so mystical and beautiful that after I went through that with him, I thought, I want to do this some more. I want to be in that space with people. So I became a hospice volunteer, but I couldn't really do that until a year had passed, because with hospices, they don't let you volunteer until you've been 13 months out from your loss. So I started as a hospice volunteer, and I started witnessing people, the dying people and their loved ones, having really deep existential questions about God and afterlife and all of that. And I really wanted to talk to them about that. But as a volunteer, we're not allowed to have those kinds of conversations with people because it's just too iffy in a hospice setting, because you never know if a volunteer is going to like evangelize and try to save their soul, or it's just not safe to let volunteers do that. Only
Sure.
trained people can do that. So I said, I want to do that. So I decided to go to college at age 56. And I got a bachelor's degree in religious studies. And I did that so that I could understand what people were thinking and believing around death. And so I could understand the different perspectives of different religions. And then I realized I wanted to be a hospice chaplain. So I did chaplaincy training and got a master's in pastoral care and did a bunch of internships. And during the chaplaincy internships, I realized I didn't actually want to be a chaplain because I'm a better talker than a listener. And I decided I wanted to be a teacher. So then I went to school some more and got a doctorate. And now I am really in a place that I love. I'm now teaching chaplaincy students who are going through that same path that I went through. I teach death, dying, and bereavement. I teach a course called Spirituality and Bereavement, and another one, Spirituality and Chronic Illness, and doing one on spiritual care for marginalized communities. So it all happened. I was said to somebody just yesterday, if my son hadn't died and introduced me to the experience of grief and loss, I wouldn't be where I am today. I don't know what my life would be like, but I feel like it wouldn't be as productive and meaningful and useful in the world and in the culture as it is because he died.
Yeah, it's really interesting how
Same for you,
things.
Brian. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how those things work out. And I know for myself, when my daughter passed, I was like, this is the worst thing that could ever possibly happen. And when people say something good can come out of it, I would say, well, no, nothing good can come from this. But we just have to trust and allow time to kind of bring to us what we're supposed to be doing. And what you're doing now is just like phenomenal. As you said, you wouldn't be doing it if it weren't for Danny dying. So what have you learned? You went through the experience of grief, and then you did the whole academic thing. So what did you learn from your academic studies of grief and death and dying?
Well, um, I learned a whole lot, and I learned things that I wish more people would learn. One of the first things I learned was that most of the people who are out there talking about grief and teaching about grief today don't have adequate training and don't actually know what they're talking about. And there's a lot of really bad grief advice floating around out there. And let's go back a little bit. Right about the time when I started the undergrad program, that's when I also started the Afterlife Conference. And that sort of ties into what I learned about grief. So very early on, this national bereavement group for bereaved parents, the Compassionate Friends, which I'm sure you know of, they were having a conference in Portland where I lived. This was 2009. And I had just written my first book about communication with my son. And I pitched them and said, hey, can I come and, do a presentation about after-death communication? And they said, absolutely not. We don't allow that content. It's very upsetting to our parents. We don't allow anybody to talk about anything spiritual or talking to dead people. We don't do that. So I got really upset. And I said, well, if they're not going to allow that at their conference, I guess I'm just going to have to start one of my own. There were no other afterlife conferences back then. So I started this, and I reached out to people who at that time were well known in this field, who had written books like, for example, Bill Guggenheim, who all your listeners know, who wrote Hello from Heaven. Sandy Goodman had a book called Love Never Dies, very well known. Lou LeGrand was another guy. I can't remember all of them at this point, but I called them and I said, hey, kids, let's put on a show. And they became the founding members of the Afterlife Conference. So one of the first things I learned about grief and loss is that there wasn't enough of a forum out in the world for people to approach it from a spiritual, metaphysical, non-religious perspective.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Terry, as you said, when you just said that very last part, from a spiritual, metaphysical, non-religious perspective, because we could go to a traditional pastor or priest or whatever, and they can talk to us from a religious perspective. Or we could go to a traditional grief counselor who may not believe in the afterlife.
Right.
And I think that's what's missing, is that person that can talk about it from a metaphysical, spiritual perspective, but not a religious perspective. And I know when I went to see a grief counselor briefly, it didn't help me at all, because there was no talk about where my daughter was or what the plan was or anything like that.
Yeah. So thank you. You're right, Brian. So you need some job description, some person who can talk about it from the metaphysical perspective and the psychological perspective. And that's what you want in a good grief counselor, that has the psychology background and knows the grief research and all the stuff, and also knows the myriad of afterlife scenarios and different ways that people might look at it. They've done a lot of studies in the field of grief research now on, does grief counseling help? And the conclusion is no.
Right.
And for different reasons than you might think. I mean, one reason is exactly what you said, is counseling generally doesn't include a spiritual component. Most counselors and therapists are not trained in spiritual care and spiritual work. But the other reason it doesn't work is because grief is not a disorder that needs to be treated. So really all counseling does, and it's good, this is a good thing, is it gives you someone to talk to. Who is interested in listening to you, because, as we all know, our friends and family cannot hold our grief. They don't want to hear about it. You can only talk to them about it up to a very limited amount of time. And either they get very uncomfortable or they get very upset and they start to grieve and feel pain too. And then you have to take care of them.
Yeah.
Right. So we can't rely on friends and family to be our grief support system to that degree. So counseling is great for that. But it doesn't provide a treatment, because grief doesn't need treatment.
Yeah. I think that's really important what you just said.
Yeah. Now, grief does need treatment when it gets into complicated grief. And so complicated grief is nowadays literally a diagnosable disorder. And there's all this criteria of what constitutes it. There is even a time frame, but we don't really pay much attention to the time frame. But for example, if you lost an aging parent, let's say your 90-year-old mother died, this is a normal and natural and expected death. Your grief response would be within certain boundaries of normal for such a loss. Totally different than if your 5-year-old kid gets run over by a car. Right. But in a normal death of an aging parent, 6 months later, you should be pretty much stabilized.
Right.
Functional, enjoying life again, having healthy relationships, creating your new life. If 3 years after that death, you're still depressed, and I hear from people all the time who say things to me like, my mother died 10 years ago. I still can't believe she's gone. I can't live without her. That's complicated grief.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, because I've seen even with the passing of a child, even though it's different from a parent. I went to some of these grief groups that you talked about, and I won't name the groups, but you went to some of these groups, and someone 10, 15, 20 years after their child passed is just as bitter as they were the day that they passed. And
exactly.
It's going to take longer with the child to get there, but you should be able to make some sort of progress in 10 or 15 or 20 years.
You should make some sort of progress in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
No matter how tragic the death is. And, you and I both know people, Brian, whose children have died in horrible, tragic, violent ways. And we hear these stories every day. And so this is why the diagnostic criteria for complicated grief is kind of full of crap, because it says 6 months.
Yeah.
And I know that if your child is killed in a drive-by shooting, you're not going to be stabilized in 6 months.
Right.
Because everything in your world changes, not just your role as a parent and your relationship with your child, but, that has like social and political elements to it. There's just so much around it. So the point being, normal grief doesn't require a therapeutic intervention. And that's why grief counseling doesn't generally work. I mean, I'd love to see all the grief counselors out there get some spiritual training, along with doctors and nurses and everybody else.
Yeah, that's what I really like about working with you, Terri, because as I said, when I think about traditional grief counseling, which is in the past at least, was your loved one is gone, get over it, move on with your life. I just don't think that's satisfactory to most people. Again, especially with a parent, maybe an aging parent or a grandmother or something, but especially when it comes to like the loss of a child, I think people need more than that to hold on to.
Or the loss of a spouse, at a young age, your 35-year-old wife. I mean, all these things. And part of the problem is we don't have these tools in our culture. We're a very death avoidant culture. We have almost no meaningful rituals around death. So if you go to, almost all indigenous societies, and pretty much anywhere outside of the Western Judeo-Christian world, you're going to find really beautiful processes for facing death, for going through the loss, dealing with the grief, finding meaning, having a spiritual practice that incorporates that meaning into the rest of your life. We don't have any of that here. We have a funeral, which for most people is really meaningless, because if they do it through their church or some tradition that they're not really bought into all that much, it becomes really meaningless. And people are in shock when they're planning a funeral, and they're not really paying attention. And there's so many different things that we can do other than that. To learn how to be with death and loss.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've really learned working with you as we've taught over the years, is this the importance of rituals, and the fact that we don't really have any in our culture. So I've seen you bring these rituals in, and they're always coming from somewhere else, because our culture, it's kind of like, I don't know if we had them one time and we forgot them or what, but there's not much, and we don't talk about death. So it's and the rituals I've seen you provide to people are so uplifting and so helpful, and help people, because you've got to process that. I think we have a tendency. I was listening to someone talk this morning about when their father had killed himself, And the mother came and just said, okay, well, we're not going to talk about this. This happened in like 1970. We're just not going to talk about it. We're going to move on. And I think there's still a lot of that in our culture. We just don't understand how to talk about grief. And that's what I really appreciate about, what you're doing with your podcast and all the things that you do.
Well, and I appreciate that about what you're doing, Brian. You've put yourself on this public forum that is addressing all this stuff. And I don't know how big your following is, but I hope it's really, really, really big, because you have a lot of really great stuff to share. Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting how you said that. It's like all those ceremonies and stuff that I do come from somewhere else. All of them, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
Never found one from modern America. And even if you look at, pre-America, like, the history of basically Anglo-Christian white people is what we're talking about. And, the people who settled here, for example. Okay, so we can go back to England and Europe and Rome. And it really was the onset of Christianity, or really monotheism, the Hebrew tradition, that really started taking all that stuff away.
Yeah.
Because prior to the Old Testament, prior to the Hebrews, we had these pagan cultures all over the Middle East and the Rome. Well, there was no Roman Empire at that time, but and they had beautiful traditions for death and birth and reproduction and honoring nature and all this stuff. And the Judeo-Christian culture just stripped that all away and wrapped it up in scripture stories.
Yeah. I was working with a couple over the weekend. It was on the 31st. So it's the Day of the Dead, and they're in San Francisco. So they said, they showed me the altar that they had built and the food that they had laid out and all this stuff. And I said, well, I didn't realize that, that was a big thing in San Francisco. They said, well, there's a big Mexican culture, I guess, there. And so they were doing this. And I was like, what a great ritual to have that as we're going in. And as I described it, we're going into the darkest part of the year. We're going into, Halloween, and we just changed the clocks forward, and we're coming into Christmas, and everything's getting darker. And a lot of us really dread that. But the way that they were talking about it, it's like, this is when the veil gets thinner. This is when we feel closer to our loved ones. It was just a beautiful way of looking at it that unfortunately didn't come from our culture.
Well, and where it really came from, it's interesting because Halloween, it's funny, just this last Halloween on Saturday, I actually performed a pagan wedding on Halloween. It was so wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Where it came from is the ancient European pagans who had a festival called Samhain, which celebrated exactly what you said. On this date, November 1st, basically, is the day, according to their tradition, when the veil was the thinnest and the dead people could just kind of really come through. And so that's where that started. The Catholic Church got hold of it and turned it into All Saints Day. And then Hallmark greeting cards got hold of it and turned it into Halloween. But there are many among us who and then of course it became the Day of the Dead in the Latin cultures.
Yeah.
And they have a mix of the Catholic version with the indigenous Aztec Mayan stuff that's in their ancestry. And that's what you see on those Day of the Dead altars. But they still believe that the dead come through on this day, and you open your door to your house and you give them food and candy. That's what it is. And little kids are going around dressed up like skeletons and ghosts and collecting candy, and they have no idea why.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And she did mention Samhain, because one of the people in the couple, she is pagan, so she mentioned Samhain, and even All Saints Day. But we don't really. It's not in our culture. It's not really taken that way. I guess it's just become a silly thing. It's just become, let's just put on a costume and walk around and get candy. And the couple I was working with, their son had just passed away early this year, so this is their first time going through this, and it was just so so meaningful to them. And they set up this altar and everything. And it just changed everything. I think the way that they were looking at it, I thought it was really, really healthy. And
to have something like that does change everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. And most people don't have that. They might, like in the Jewish tradition, you light a candle on the anniversary of the person's death. That's it. That's what I grew up with. And there are deeper traditions than that. but in most modern Jewish families, they don't go any deeper than that. I don't know what they do in the Catholic tradition. I don't know what they do in the evangelical tradition. I know evangelicals have really long funerals that last all day long.
Yeah.
But what do they do in a year?
Yeah.
Anything?
There's really not much that I know of. And I know, as you and I, as we work together, we've been teaching, we show people the altars that you and I both built. And
Yes.
the response that people give when they see the altar that we have to honor our ancestors, our children, in our case, our children who have passed, and how we keep that as part of our lives. I think it really helps people say, realize there's something that they're missing if they don't work with someone like yourself, and learn these things that you're teaching.
Do you want to show your altar on this recording that we're doing right now? Would that be?
Oh, I don't have it available right now.
I do. It would take me a minute to find it though. So, I mean,
Okay,
if you want me to,
you can go ahead and look for that. We'll keep talking while you're looking
right.
for that. But yeah, I think like I said, Terry, what I've appreciated about working with you over the years is just there's so much richness that we can bring to this that I think people don't really realize is even available. And that's what, like the Afterlife Conference, you've been doing it for, I know we missed it last year. So is it the 11th one that's coming up?
This would be in 2021. It would be our 11th one, which is just amazing. I can't even believe that it's been going this long. And boy, does that make me happy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there's a real need for it. And you've got training coming up this weekend. So you got something coming up really soon.
Oh yeah, I started a couple of I guess it was just a month ago, online grief support groups. So, people aren't going to their groups and their therapists or anything anymore. So, I'm now doing every other Sunday, basically just a support group, except we're doing it on Zoom. So, I just finished one session of it, which was four sessions, which is over. And now starting on this Sunday, November 8th, we have 4 more, and that one is themed to the holiday season.
Okay.
So that's our holiday season one, and people can find that on spiritualityandgrief.com.
Okay.
And here I found, and we do, and in this, we don't just talk like people usually do in support groups. We actually do ceremonies, and I do have them build an altar as part of the process. And I actually found the videos. Brian, do you want me to share them?
Yeah, let me go ahead and allow you to share your screen.
All right, hold on. Oops, hold 1 second. Just a minute. Okay, let me put this down here. And I will share my screen.
Okay. Hit the wrong thing there. There we go.
Okay. So the first one that we're going to look at is Brian's altar, which he made for a class that we taught together a couple years ago. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, I can see it. So for anybody who's listening to the podcast and not watching on YouTube, I'll go ahead. I'll explain as we go through. But go ahead and play.
Well, it has your voice on it too.
Yeah, so. It does. There it
My
does.
meditation altar, where I sit every day and meditate and think about my daughter Shayna, who passed away at this point 3 years ago, and also to bring peace to myself and kind of recenter and try to reach higher states. On my altar, I have a Jesus statue. I bought this at a little local shop thinking it was actually a Buddha, and thought it was a really cute Buddha. When I got it home, I looked it up and found out it's Jesus, who's a Japanese figure, who is someone who watches over children who have crossed the other side to keep them safe when their parents aren't there with them. Jesus is also revered by people who are spiritual seekers as he watches them on their spiritual journey. So that was a fortunate synchronicity that I bought that statue thinking it was actually a Buddha. This is a candle. I like to light candles when I meditate. This figure is a compassionate Buddha. I saw this statue in a TV show. I had no idea what it was, but it just really called out to me. So I Googled it and found out this is actually Buddha, who is showing compassion for the cares of the world, or for the sorrows in the world. So I found this statue on eBay, and I love it because it's used and it's actually kind of worn. I can tell where it's been handled. So I love my compassionate Buddha statue. It's made out of wood. This is my Krishna statue that my older daughter bought for me because she knows I just love looking at God in different forms. I believe God has many different facets, so I like to look at different ways of looking at God. This is the Ganesh that my same daughter bought for me when she was on a trip in New Orleans. This is a keepsake box that a friend of mine made for me shortly after Shana passed. And in the box, she placed 4 heart-shaped rocks and gave me some other things that she had made for me. But she went to the beach and found these rocks, and they represent myself, my wife, and my 2 daughters. Also in that box is a crystal that someone who became a friend of ours, Shana, after she passed, she came to him. He didn't know us. He didn't know Shana. But she came to him. He reached out to a mutual friend, and she contacted me. And he told me that Shana had contacted him and asked him to give me that crystal. Also, when I find feathers and other keepsake things, I put it in the box and keep them there. This is a pair of Shana's glasses. I like to keep something of Shana's close to me when I'm doing my meditation. I feel like just nice having something of her physically close to me. This is an amethyst that I picked up when I was in Colorado for the properties of amethyst. Plus, I just like the way it looks. And purple is my favorite color, and is also Shana's favorite color. This is my incense burner. This is my altar itself. I love it. I found this on Etsy, actually. A guy makes them by hand, so I love my altar. This is something that my daughter gave me, so I ponder this when I'm sitting here doing my meditations. And I've got some prayer beads that a friend of mine gave me, which I use on occasion. So this is my sacred space that I come to every day to do my meditations and to, I guess, escape the cares of the world.
Yay,
Yeah.
Brian, that's so wonderful. I've seen it so many times and I never get tired of it.
Yeah, it's wild looking at it now because it's been 2 years since I did that, and it's changed a little bit, but I still sit there every day.
Wait, hold on. Where is that coming from? Okay.
All right, we're back.
All right. Oh, I didn't know that you turned it off. Okay.
All right, so let's look at your altar, Terry.
Okay, you want to see my altar? Okay, I just
Yeah.
hope we don't get that thing again. Okay, so because that happens on YouTube, doesn't it? It just
Yeah, the
automatically
autoplay thing.
starts the next thing. Okay, so let me share my screen again, and now we'll look at my altar. Mine's okay. Share sound. Okay, here we go. This is my grief healing altar, and starting on the far left, that you can see that little piece of paper that's in the white frame. That is a page, a little torn page from the Bible that blew into my garden on the wind during the Santa Rosa fires. And it is Matthew 9 on one side and Matthew 10 on the other side, which is a long story. I can send you a link to an article about it. It was a very powerful message from the divine. The little gold pottle here, that is my son's ashes, and that's a picture of my son. And there's a little collection of healing stones that I use for chakra work and meditation. There are 2 candles. Both of them have significance. One was given to me by an important shamanism teacher of mine, and a little colorful one on the right was given to me by my son's hospice nurse. And there's my shaman rattle there in front of the candles. And this little beautiful white statue of an angel was actually made by my son in school when he was about 6 years old. He always kind of had a sense that he wasn't going to be here long. So these are the things that are on my altar right now. They change periodically depending on what I'm working on. But I think this is a good example of an altar that is very personal and very spiritual, having to do with my own personal transformative experiences on my spiritual journey.
We'll get back to Grief to Growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best-selling, easy-to-read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.growth.com, or text GROWTH, GROWTH, to 31996. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grief-to-growth, www.patreon.com/GRIEF, 2 to make a financial contribution. And now, back to Grief to Growth.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I love your altar, and I love that everything has meaning and everything has a story. And that thing about altars, 'cause when we've taught people before, it's like it's personal to you, whatever you want to put there. Because sometimes people say, well, what should I put on my altar? It's like whatever works for you, right?
Yeah, well, in my classes that I'm teaching now for the chaplaincy program, the people in these classes, they're such an interesting group. I've got a Buddhist monk and a Jesuit monk and a Catholic priest. I have a medical doctor, a funeral director, couple other Buddhists, a Baptist pastor. I just have like such an interesting group of people. And so these are people who've done a lot of spiritual work, but most of them have never really done altars like this. And so I assign this to them. Their assignment is to make an altar and send a video. And they do such an incredible job. They put so much into it. And what that says to me is that we need this. Our souls are just starving for this. And I'll tell you a very sad story. My sister and her husband just got a cute, sweetest little dog about 3 months ago, and she just got hit by a car and died the other day. And they're just devastated. And it was really kind of horrible how it happened. And so the first thing I told my sister to do was make an altar in your house. And the way you do that with a pet is you take their bed and all their toys and their bowl and their collar and all their stuff, and you put it in a corner of your house. And that becomes the place where you do your grieving. It takes your grief, which is so big, and it puts it in a smaller space, in a container. And that's what the altar does. So this little space, she made this little space with all the dog's things. And of course, her cats walk over there and lay down and go and sleep on it because the energy is there. And so when you're just really suffering and you're crying and you're just miserable and you can't get a breath, you just go and you sit in that space with that altar and just be with it.
Yeah.
It's just one little simple thing. They also have a lot of trauma around this dog getting hit by a car. So I told them, and her husband was there when it happened. She came a few minutes later. They eat, and the husband has this image in his mind of the dog breaking free of the leash and running into the street and bam, getting hit. That's the image he has. My sister's image is she comes running down the street and her husband is sitting there at the curb, just crumpled up and sobbing, holding this dead dog. So each of them have a different visual imprint. And so I told them to each draw a picture of that imprint that is keeping them awake at night, that is driving them crazy, that visual that you can't stop seeing.
Yeah.
Draw your own picture. Don't show it to each other. It's each your own personal thing. And then go out in the backyard and dig a hole and bury it in the dirt together. And give that image and the intensity of that pain, you give it to the earth. And let the earth hold it for you, because the earth is so big and strong and it can transform. The paper will decompose and become nitrogen for the soil or whatever. And that way you get it out of your body into a representational form and you put it into the world of spirit through the earth. So those are the kinds of things that, none of that exists in our current culture. It's all borrowed from somewhere.
Yeah. And I think those things are very important. And it's interesting. I love the way you said that, our grief is so big, and this way is a way of at least kind of making it into a manageable size. And I never really thought about that when I was putting my altar together, but it does kind of feel that way, right? That's the place I go to, and you go there and you feel the feelings. That's one of the really important things about grief too, is you got to feel the feelings. There are people that try to bypass it or ignore it. You've got to process it. And it gives you a chance, a time, a space to where I'm going to go process this for a certain period of time, and then when I get up, I can do other things, at least for a while.
That's right. Because you can control it, and you feel no control. You have complete loss of control when you have a tragic loss. And so if you can create this little space and contain it in a container, then you can control when you're going to really feel it and when you're not. And you're like, you know what, right now I'm really feeling it, or right now I really want to feel it. And you go over to your altar, you light a candle, you sit there, you talk to your loved one. Maybe you write in a journal, you cry, you pray, you sing a song, whatever. And then you're done for the
Yeah.
moment. And just
Right.
like you said, you go back to work or whatever. And then when you feel the need to do that again, you go there. I mean, that's what churches and, places of worship are supposed to be for.
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
just make our own little church in the house.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, because I think a lot of people are kind of missing that. Even when we do go to church, it's become so uh, generic. I don't even know the word. It's just not, for a lot of people, it's just become so rote. There's not much feeling to it, and it's not really personal. So, and the thing is, I guess when people, you can do this in your own home, and you can do it every day. You don't have to go somewhere else. You don't have to go to a special designated, holy place. You can make a holy place in your own home.
Yeah, and do the proactive, very intentional work of interacting with the holy place. That's why funerals are not helpful for most people, because they're rote and they're impersonal. A lot of people who don't have a church or a synagogue or a spiritual community, I've seen this happen with so many people. So somebody dies and they don't even know, who do I call? How do I have a funeral? And they'll just call like whatever religion they think they're supposed to identify with. Because again, these are, unchurched people.
Yeah.
And they go, well, dad was kind of Catholic, I guess. He never went to church, but let me get the phone book out here and call the local Catholic church and hire somebody to come do the funeral. That's just like terrible. But not many people, I mean, how many people listening know someone in your circle, in your network, that can organize and facilitate a funeral for you?
Right.
Probably not many.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. So I know you have a Facebook group called Bad Grief Guidance.
Yeah.
So what does that mean, and what's an example of bad grief guidance?
So, so many people come to me, and you too, Brian, I'm sure, bereaved parents who have gotten just the worst advice. And a lot of that advice comes from some of these groups that I don't approve of. These national groups with conferences and chapter meetings, and a lot of them have websites and Facebook groups. And these groups are led by peers. It's peer led, and the peers are other bereaved parents. But they are not, there's no training required to become a chapter leader or a group leader, other than how to market your group. No requirement for any kind of education or certification in grief or trauma or even group dynamics. And I have seen so many people be so broken by these groups. Like you described, Brian, people have gone into these groups and seen people who have been coming there for 10 or 15 years who still say things like, I can't get out of bed in the morning. I still can't accept that my child died 15 years ago. And they're still coming to these groups, and they should not be still coming. The idea of those groups is it's not supposed to be your life for the rest of your life.
Right.
And people say to me, I went to that first meeting of that group and I saw that lady who's been there for 15 years. And the first thing I thought was, I don't want to be like her in 15 years. Is that the model that they're showing me of where I'm going to be in 15 years?
Right.
Number one, that's bad grief guidance right there, having people like that as a model. You should put them in a separate group and not have them in the room with the new people coming in, because you don't want the new people to see that.
Yeah.
There's something online, anybody can find it. You can Google it. It says it's 64 things I wish someone had told me about grief. And this was contributed by many people, and they made this list. And most of the things are pretty good. Probably 5 or 6 of them are absolutely terrible things to tell a grieving person. One of them is holidays, birthdays, and celebrations will be sad forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another one that stands out is, no matter how much you think it's going to hurt, it will be a million times worse.
Yeah.
Those are just the two that come into my mind.
Mm-hmm.
There are, you don't say things like that to grieving people.
Right.
You also don't say things like God wanted another flower in his garden and all that crap.
Yeah.
But there, so I heard so many stories of people who really suffered behind these kinds of things that I started this group on Facebook called Bad Grief Guidance. And people were joining up and telling me stories about the kind of stuff that they heard. And then people in religious families, of course, were hearing that God was punishing them, or that, their child who died, who was a drug addict or was gay or something, is in hell, and all these. And, the religious beliefs is a whole different category.
Right.
Of bad grief guidance. There's also something, and I don't mind naming the names of these groups publicly because I think people should know. There's a group called Grief Share. I think it's griefshare.org. And it's a Christian group, and they don't really make that very obvious on their website, but there's a tab on their website that's called something like Why We Grieve or How to Heal from Grief or something. And if you drill down in that website, it tells you the reason you suffer is because you've been disobedient to God. And they actually say this to grieving people.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, there is, and some of it's, a lot of it's, most of it's probably well-meaning, but the other thing is, you and I were talking. I know there's really common, this 5 stages of grief.
Oh God.
The people will come to me and say, well, which stage am I in, and what's my next stage? And so, what's your reaction to the 5 stages of grief?
Well, it's not just my reaction; it's the reaction of the entire grief support community and psychologists and academics everywhere. Nobody uses that anymore. And what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did is she interviewed 200 patients in a hospital for her book. So it wasn't actual research format. It was anecdotal, just talking to people and getting their stories. And these were dying people. They weren't grieving, they were dying. And she noticed that the 5 most common responses they tended to have were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And she put it in the book. I believe she did call it stages, but it's not official research. It's, it wasn't done in proper research parameters.
Right.
And so really what she observed was that people were having these 5 reactions to facing their death. If you think of them as reactions or responses rather than stages, you can add another 500 to that list.
Yes, exactly.
Right? So like one response could be fear. That's not on her list. Guilt, remorse, perhaps joy and exhilaration. I'm finally going to die. I'm not going to be suffering from cancer anymore. There's all these different kinds of responses. That's how it should have been presented. But it caught on really big. And everyone latched onto it because everyone likes to make lists.
Yeah.
And it became really popular. And we know now that there are no stages. There's nothing sequential about it. You can go through the most tragic loss in the world and never experience denial,
Right,
or bargaining. Anger is pretty common.
yeah.
Depression certainly is. So is acceptance. But you could go through this and not be depressed, and sometimes not even be angry. So they don't exist, these stages. So what we have now is what we call tasks of grieving. And you can look that up. The researchers who developed that is Terris Rando, Rando, William Worden, Worden. These are the people who are formulating these new ideas now. And tasks are just about like things you have to do to deal with your grief every day, just like you have tasks like you have to clean your house and put gas in your car, feed the dog. And the tasks are things like, there's one process called the 6 R's, letter R. And I'm not going to remember all 6 of them right now, but some of them are recognize the loss, which is, accept that it has happened. And sometimes if someone dies, like in a war, or they're estranged from the family, or they're a missing person, you won't see a body.
Mm.
And that complicates that task if you don't see a body, because it's hard to recognize the loss. Then there's react to the separation, which is feel your feelings, scream and cry, do what you have to do. Recollect, which is to sit with your family at Christmas and Thanksgiving, where there's that empty chair where that person used to sit, and talk about the person. Remember that Thanksgiving when she was 7 years old and she threw up on the table or whatever, bring them into the conversation. So many families will not talk about the dead person, especially if it's a child. My own family would never talk about my son when we were together until I gave them permission to.
Yes.
I had to teach them. I want to talk about him.
Right. Right. Yeah. A lot of times people will think, well, I don't want to bring it up because I don't want to make her sad.
Right.
That's another misconception, especially when it's a parent that had a child, pass. They think they're going to make us think about our kid like we're not already thinking.
Like we're not already thinking about him all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what is really happening there is it makes them sad.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
It's really about them. And so then they get sad, then we end up having to take care of them because they haven't done the proper, grieving tools. So it is really important. My mother came up with the most beautiful idea a couple of Mother's Days ago. She called me up and she said, here's what I'm going to, because my mother always gave me presents on Mother's Day. And she said, here's what I'm going to give you for Mother's Day from now on. I'm going to call you up and we're going to just talk about your son for 20 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that the coolest thing?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've passed that on to other friends of mine. So on Mother's Day now, well, my mom has died now, but I've got this like phone network going on of all these mothers calling each other up and saying, I'm just going to let you talk about your child for 20 minutes.
Yeah, that's great. So another question I wanted to ask you, because you and I have talked about toxic theology also. So religious beliefs, do they help or hinder the grieving process, the healing process?
Depends on the belief. Right?
Yeah.
And the language is so iffy because if you have a spiritual belief in reincarnation or you believe in the survival of consciousness after death, is that a religious belief? So then we have to get into defining what's religion and what's spirituality.
That's a great point. Yeah.
But we believe that some part of our essence, our consciousness, lives on in another dimension, and that is extremely helpful. And hopefully we can talk a little bit about mediums in that context.
Yeah, let's do it.
But, however, if your religious belief says that all suicides go to hell and your loved one died by suicide, then that is not going to be a helpful belief. And in the middle of your grief and everything else you're going through, you're going to have to struggle with that horrible idea that your teenage son is burning in flames in hell forever, will never get out. Yeah. And then when you die and you go to heaven, you won't ever get to see him again.
Yeah.
So it totally depends on the belief. There's been some really good studies on that. If anybody listening wants to email me, go to spiritualityandgrief.com and you can email me through there and just tell me you want to see some of the studies and I'll send them to you. There's really a good one that's used a lot now on positive and negative religious coping.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you made an excellent point. It does depend on the belief, and you also another great thing you said was, where do we separate what's a religious belief and what's metaphysical spiritual belief? So that leads me to another question, because I've had people ask me this. So if I want to work with you, do I have to believe what you believe? Do I have to believe in the continuation of consciousness? Do I have to have any particular belief?
Absolutely not. I mean, the people who work with me, like my sister and her husband with the dog who died, they don't believe in anything.
Okay.
But the funny thing about belief is these ceremonies and rituals have no religious belief attached to them at all. Mm-hmm. And that's what's so nice about them. And so I have given these rituals like draw the image of their trauma on a piece of paper and bury it in the earth. Mm-hmm. Or the string ceremony. Have we done the string ceremony, Brian? Yeah. The string ceremony, there's no religion to that at all. Right. And so even the most devout religious person will respond to that because their soul just says, oh God, I need this. This feels good. The string thing I'll show you just for your audience really
Yeah,
quick.
please.
Is so you get a little piece of string like this,
Mm-hmm.
and you just take your pain and you roll up the string in a little ball, and you cry and you say, I'm so angry that car hit my dog, and my son killed himself, blah, blah, blah. You just talk it into, I'm angry at God. I'll never forgive the drunk driver. And you just tell it into the string, and you roll it in a little ball so it has a little piece hanging off like that.
Mm-hmm.
You tie it up, and then you take it outside and you tie it in a tree, and you let it unfurl. And it just hangs there in the tree forever.
Mm-hmm.
As it decomposes, it becomes like the Tibetan prayer flags that blow in the wind and the sun, and they shred and tatter, and all the prayers contained in them are released into the universe. So doing a little thing like this releases your
Mm-hmm.
pain. And if I'm showing that to a person who identifies as religious with a belief in, quote, God, I'll just use God language.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, just put it in here and give it to God.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
then hang it in a tree and just give it to God.
Yeah.
One word changes everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So before we started recording, we were talking about different types of grief, and we were talking about right now, it seems like everybody I talk to is in some form of grief. So let's talk about different types of grief.
And right now, everybody, is November 2nd, 2020,
Yeah.
the day before the election, just for reference. And no matter what side of the aisle you're on, you are probably freaking out. And we're grieving what Brian and I were talking about before was there are many, many types of losses that we have. So we have relationship loss when someone dies or you get divorced. You have material or financial loss if you lose your job or your house burns down. You've lost something material, stock market crashes, whatever. There's role, ROLE, loss. If you were a caregiver and the person you were taking care of dies, you don't have that role anymore.
Mm-hmm.
If you were a wife and your husband dies, you're not a wife anymore. So there's all these different kinds. I don't want to go deeply into it right now, but what so many people in America and in the world really too, because of COVID, are experiencing is system loss, where the systems that were supposed to take care of us in our assumptions that we're supposed to be taken care of by said systems,
Mm-hmm.
they're failing. And that could be the medical establishment, the medical research, the Center for Disease Control. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're not combating COVID. The
Mm-hmm.
hospitals don't have enough equipment. They're not doing their job. So it appears to some people.
Mm-hmm.
The government, I don't even want to get into touchy politics here, but I think no matter what side we're on, the elections can't be trusted. The news media can't be trusted. Everything is not secure. And there is grief around that. The systems are failing us.
Yeah.
Religious belief is also a system.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this massive collective grieving going on in America. And after the election, regardless of who wins, millions of people are going to be grieving on one side or the other.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what side you are, just the energy of grief, like a dark cloud over the country, and anger and separation and division. It's heavy, heavy stuff. What do we do with that energy?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and I think it's an interesting observation because as you and I have been talking, people over the last several months, and everybody I talk to, as you said, on both sides, they're all freaked out right now. And I'm like, okay, in a couple of days or a week or however long it takes us to get the results of this election, at least 30-40% of us are going to be in deep grief. We're going to be feeling like we just lost the system, the thing that we've relied on. So as people that help people through this, you and I have to figure out, what do we tell people? How do we deal with that?
I think having community grief ceremonies is a really good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe on your next podcast, maybe we could even do this together. Make it a ceremony and have everybody do one of these strings and just, to to express our broken hearts, or we
Yeah.
can also do a string for positive affirmations, our prayers for healing for the country, any kind. And, it's another thing that we don't have in this culture is community grieving, but we kind of do, like when there's a mass shooting, all the people come out and they lay flowers and they
Yeah.
make little memorials. That's a beautiful thing. And I'm really happy to see people in America doing that. So maybe we should come up with some way to do that for the election, or just for, the loss of safety
Yeah.
in our society. And the thing is, we were never really safe. That sense of safety was always an illusion.
The loss of the illusion of safety.
The illusion of safety.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there's so much. I mean, as you went through some of those different types of losses, I mean, my wife lost her job. We lost our health insurance. There's everybody, people going through all this stuff, people losing their businesses, small business owners are going out of business. So there's a tremendous amount of loss and grief right now, and people have not really been trained how to deal with it. So I think, taking courses like yours that you've got coming up this weekend, even if you haven't maybe had a loss yet, or if you haven't had a loss of a person, just understanding the whole idea of grief as it relates to everything, and any type of deep loss that impacts us, at a deep level.
Yeah. And, another kind of loss that we're experiencing is we've lost freedom and autonomy.
Absolutely.
We're
Yeah.
not free to move about the world like we were.
Yeah.
You could drill down on that list of losses and just find so many things. Another thing that's happening too is relationships are breaking up, not just because of politics, certainly because of politics. There's been rifts in families, but even COVID. One of my longest best friends that I've had for 50 years, who lives 2 doors down, is not speaking to me anymore right now because he's like excessively extreme about COVID. He still washes the cereal boxes when he brings them home from the grocery store.
Okay.
I'm not quite at that level. And
Yeah.
he got really mad at me because he thought I was too loose about COVID.
Oh, wow.
And, there's this big split in our relationship. I mean, people are just going crazy right now.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing. There's a loss of family. I mean, I know 2 people that emailed me just within a couple of weekends ago that were friends with their fathers on Facebook that have unfriended their fathers on Facebook because of politics. And it's like, I can't talk to you on Facebook anymore because we're on different sides of this political thing. So it's a time of the world, really, us recognizing, what's going on, and bright lines being drawn in. I like what you said also, though, about the illusion of safety, because we do have this presumption that the systems are going to take care of us, you and I, that our kids are going to outlive us. And then we realize that was never promised to us. And that can be a big loss.
Nothing was ever promised to us. And, that's another thing that in the Judeo-Christian way of thinking is there's this idea that if you're a good person and you're a faithful believer,
Yeah,
there's a promise of protection and safety. But of course, we know from the book of Job, we just know from life that there's no protection and safety. This shit's going to happen to you no matter what. And that's why the religion designed it so that the promise is after you die.
yeah.
The promise is in the afterlife. So we can't show it to you now. And your life, you're going to have poverty and sickness and loss and all kinds of stuff in this life. But if you believe in this belief, you'll get your reward after you die. And that's just such a bad belief because it's been twisted into thinking that piousness and faithfulness can protect you even in this life.
Mm-hmm.
I once had a woman, I was renting out a room in my house, and this woman came to interview as a potential roommate. And I asked her for references, and she said, "Oh, I don't need any references. I'm a Christian."
Yeah.
It's like, where do you get this idea, that you have something special? Because your life's going to fall apart just like mine and everybody else's. So if you go to the Buddhist way of looking at it, the idea starts out with, yes, of course, things are going to fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
And what we really do in our spiritual practice is learn how to go with the flow.
Yeah.
And how to be with the things because they are going to happen.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I like the way you put that about, the promise, if there is a promise, was for the afterlife, but people have misinterpreted that. And so many people come to me and say, what did I do wrong?
Mm.
Or what did my son do wrong? Or why am I being punished? I must have done, something wrong, because otherwise this wouldn't have happened to me. And it's such a, I hate to say it's a juvenile point of view, but it really is. But it's what we're taught in Sunday school. And a lot of us who grew up in Sunday school, that if something bad happens, then surely you did something to trigger it. And so that's we talked about, is religion good or bad? That's an example where it can be very, very bad, because it really, people now, they're piling guilt on top of their grief, because they're like, I must be responsible for this.
Yeah, and that is an infantile way of looking at it. It's exactly the way you learned it in Sunday school and or interpreted it when you were 5 years old, in the
Yeah.
mind of a 5-year-old. And so most people get their theology at 5 years old and never think about it again. You just go through your life, and then you're 35 and 45 and you still believe this because you've had no reason to change it.
Yeah.
Until something shocks you into changing it, like losing a child, then you may start questioning that theology.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing too, because there has to be something to knock us off that center. We're gonna it's momentum, whatever you want to call it. We're going to stay on something until it doesn't work anymore, and that's one thing about grief, that it a lot of times causes us to reevaluate. Reevaluate everything, right? We start saying, well, this isn't working for me, and that's when it can become a blessing. That's when we can start to
Well, that's
actually build a
healthy
new
grieving.
life. Mhm.
Because if you don't reevaluate, then you're stuck. And that's how you get into complicated grief. So you reevaluate your relationships, your values, your spiritual beliefs. You reevaluate your personal life. Like, why am I working at this job that I hate?
Yeah.
I guess I don't need to be here anymore. I don't have this child to send to college. Maybe now I'm free to be an artist,
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. And that's kind of how it happened to me. Speaking of grief to growth, I
Yeah.
never would have thought that this is what I would do. But, before my son died, I was in a terrible abusive marriage. I was obsessed with trying to keep that marriage together and suffering in that every day. I had no real passions or interests in any sort of professional work. I was a writer. I made a living as a copywriter. I mean, my life was just kind of nothing. And now it's so full of meaning. And so that's because I allowed things to shift. So if people don't allow things to shift, you're going to see somebody who's had a loss 10 years ago, and they're going to be mad at God.
Yeah.
I had one client who told me this. 2 of his children died. And he said, when I became a parent, I only asked God for one thing: to keep my children safe. And he didn't do that. And I'm mad at God. And the answer to that is, you have to change what you think God is.
Yeah.
And if you're not willing to do that, then you're going to be mad like he is
Yeah.
and not heal.
Yeah, that, and you really have to start to change your perspective on the whole idea of death and dying, and what it really is. Because if we understand, everybody that is born dies. Every single person that is born dies. The only difference is how and when. So when we get angry that God took our child, we're really saying he took our child too early. We're arguing with the timing, right?
Yes.
That they should have lived longer, and that's not for us to determine. And longer is not necessarily better. I mean, the more when we really start to open up our minds and think about this, being here longer is not necessarily better.
Well, especially when you have a big view of what here is.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
If you've got like the 30,000 mile view from space of like, what is here? Earth, this body is just like a stopover on this much bigger journey that goes on forever. If you believe that this isn't all there is for our consciousness to experience, then you can see that bigger view and you're not so attached to this. But if you think that this is it, you get this one life here in this city, in this country, with this family and this husband, and then the husband dies or something. I mean, that's the end of the world.
Yeah.
Because you think this is all there is. And again, this is kind of an Eastern versus a Western view. This is also something, speaking of community grieving, that is so interesting about climate change. And a lot of people don't like me to say this, but the way people getting upset about climate change is kind of just a form of that kind of attachment. It's like, hey, we're here on the earth. We want it to behave the way we want it to behave. Climate change has always happened. The earth has heated and cooled and heated and cooled, and planets blow up all the time. If you look at it from that big view, this is just a little rock floating around in the universe. And who are we to think that we have the control to keep it from dying? Yeah. We do have control about taking care of it. We can certainly treat it better.
Yeah.
But in the bigger picture of things, no matter what we do, sooner or later, it's going to die because it's a thing that was born too.
Yeah. That's a good point.
It's
we do. We have this attachment, and I go back to religion because you and I talked a lot about religion over the years. And I think about when I was a kid, I'm like, okay, well, if we really believe that heaven is our home and heaven is so much better, then why are we sad when people go there?
Right.
It's like, shouldn't we be happy?
Have you ever asked that question of your pastor when you were a kid? Or
I probably did, because I got in all kinds of trouble in Sunday school because I would always ask those types of questions. It's just interesting how people are. I was talking about near-death experiences. Back to religion again. I was interviewing someone, and when people have near-death experiences, a lot of time they get kicked out of the churches. They're like, we don't want you talking about that. I'm like,
oh yeah,
I thought we were supposed to believe in all that stuff.
Right. You're supposed to believe in that, but your near-death experience has to include Jesus and pearly gates.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, then you get kicked out of the church. One of my favorite Sunday school questions that somebody told me he asked when he was a kid, talking about the 10 Commandments, thou shalt have no other gods before me.
Mm-hmm.
The kid says, you mean there are other gods?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that's one of the questions I would have asked too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Terri, it's really great catching up with you, and I could talk to you about this stuff all day long. But I want you to let people know where they can reach you, find out more about you. I know you've got some stuff coming up short term. You got the Afterlife Conference coming up again, hopefully next spring. So let's talk. Let people know what's going on in your life.
Well, the Afterlife Conference, we are planning to do it live in June, but it probably won't happen that way. So it'll be online again. We did it online in 2020 and it was great and I loved it. And I'd like to do it that way every year if I could, but I'm contractually obliged to the hotel to do it there this year. I don't know what's going to happen there, but go to afterlifeconference.com, join the email list, and you'll get all that information. I've got this grief group starting on Saturday. Go to spiritualityandgrief.com for that. And if you're interested in professional development, I've got a thing coming up in January called the Conference on Death and Bereavement Studies. There's 7 CE credits for social workers, nurses, etc. That's a day-long online seminar. And also a class coming up in a certificate program for spirituality and mental health. Lots of stuff. So go to spiritualityandgrief.com and you'll find everything there.
Yeah, and I would recommend to people to join Terri's newsletter because you're always sending out information about, and you can get that through spirituality and grief.com, right? Sign up for a newsletter.
Yeah, or afterlifeconference.com.
Or Afterlife Conference.
Any place you can subscribe. And so it's a newsletter that goes out once a month called the Afterlife Advocate.
Yeah. Well, great, Terri. It's good catching up with you again. Looking forward to everything you got going on, and hopefully work together soon.
Thank you, my dear. I love you to pieces.
All right, Terri. See you later.
Okay, bye.
That's it for another episode of Grief to Growth. I sure hope you got something out of it. Please stay in contact with me by reaching out at www.grieftogrowth.com. That's grief, the number 2, growth.com. Or you can text the word growth to 31996. That's simply text growth, GROWTH, to 31996. Since you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure you're subscribed. So hit the subscribe button and then hit the little bell here, and it'll notify you when I have new content. Always, please share the information if you enjoy it. That helps me to get more views and to get the message out to more people. Thanks a lot and have a wonderful day.